how to color grade D-Log footage from the DJI Osmo Pocket 3. I know, you're saying, this is gonna melt my brain. It's not, I promise. In the next couple of minutes, you're gonna figure out how you can get a cinematic vibe to your footage. And it's really easy, it's step by step. And if you get stuck, just pause the video, go back, and absolutely you have a look. If I can do this, you can do it. In this example, I'm going to use Premiere Pro, but you can use DaVinci, CapCut. The ideas here are the same. So let's dive in. First things first, and this applies no matter the software that you're using, let's set up our color space. And yeah, you know what? You can eyeball it, but everybody's display device, whether it's a monitor or phone, whatever, it projects colors slightly differently unless you've got it professionally calibrated, which some of us do, some of us don't. So the scopes don't lie, like hips. Some of you may remember that. Anyway, enough cheese. First off, in Premiere Pro, and by the way, these points are very valid right across all of the software that you're using. You need to see scopes, all right? So if you don't see it in Premiere Pro, make sure there's a tick next to it, and also make sure there's a tick next to Lumetric Color. I've got Premiere Pro customized towards my liking, so you may not see it like exactly like this because I've reorganized things, but all of these things are there and you really should use them. To explain all of these really basically and quickly, and once you kind of understand these, especially this one, then a lot of it will be quite easy to move forward. First up here is, this is our waveform. I've set this to Luma. So we've RGB, Luma, YC, blah, 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 right? And there's two numbers here that you really need to pay attention to. One is this one up here, which is 100. And then there's one down here, which is 0. Now, let's just for fun show you what happens when we go and make things up here and drive it up. See, there's this a solid line here. Everything is over 100. And if we look at the image here, you're like, it's kind of nearly all gone. This here, Luma, is a measure of brightness. So anything over 100 means any of the bright parts of the image, they are clipping. You are losing information. It's gone. You cannot fix this. So if you shoot your footage and it comes out looking like this, it's very unlikely you're going to be able to fix it. So yeah. So this is an example of where things are. Let's just double click here to bring it back. And likewise, the opposite on the dark parts of the image, which are known as the shadows, once they go below 0, we're losing detail. And again, if you underexpose your shot or overexpose it, it's going to come out like this, and it's very hard to recover it. However, D-Log is 10-bit color, which gives us a little bit more scope, and because it's a flat color profile, the darker parts of the image, the shadows and the highlights, the brighter parts of the image, they're just, there's a little bit more information in there, but if it's screwed up, it's screwed up. Let's bring all this back to normal. So this is it. This is right out of the Osmo Pocket 3. This is D-Log, 10-bit color, all of that. As you can see, it's a little bit washed out. Now there's two ways that we can do this, right? First off is we need to get this into the Rec 709 color space, which I know sounds like really confusing, and I'm not going to get into the intricacies of it, but that's what most folks will be working in unless it's a HDR workflow. But we're going with Rec 709. This is not Rec 709 essentially in this color space because it's a flat color profile. That's why it's a little bit washed out. So what you can do is you can convert this to Rec 709, and DJI have provided an official lot to convert it. So we can go to browse, and I've downloaded it already here, and we can see DJI Osmo Pocket 3 D-Log M to Rec 709. And if we open this on our input lot, boom, it's don't look amazing, but we can see there's more contrast. The colors are back because it's gone from that kind of flat washed out vibe, which don't look too bad, to this. So now we're at our starting point. So that's it converted. And the next rules of thumb really, and you do you here, we can either shift the colors to something like an orange and teal, which is quite cinematic. We can do that first, and then we can work on the exposure, which is how bright and dark, and we'll fix up how it looks. So you can do it depends on what you want to do ultimately, but for me, I kind of start at the top and work my way down, but you'll eventually go, I'll fix the colors first, or I'll do this first. Now, we've got our input LUT, our conversion. So in Premiere Pro, you can just hit auto and see what it does. Sometimes it doesn't do much. And if we look here on our Luma here, we can see, ooh, okay, we all our shadows are here. All our dark parts are here, and as you can see on screen, even eyeballing it, it doesn't look great. So if we get our shadows here and we start bringing them up, we can see we're expanding. And then the blacks down here, we can also bring these up a little bit, but you can see now we've got something going. So we're just tipping on the 0 here, which is the point of no return in no more detail. And then up here, we can push this another little bit up to 100 if we want. But to my eyes right now, this looks pretty good. And also the white balance, we can select the eyedropper tool. And we can do this if we want, but that's not pure perfect white, and it doesn't need to be perfect white, but you can see it does make a bit of a difference. So you can either eyeball it this way, you can take what comes out of the camera, or use your eyedropper on something that is close to white. And then these are going to be a little bit balanced, but you can see here, the blues in the image, there's a little bit too much. So if we want to balance this out, we can just push this to the right to make it a little bit warmer, because that's what white balance is, how warm or cool an image is, and depending on what you're going for, you might want to something spooky or something nice and hazy and fluffy. But anyway, right. And then the last part of the scopes down here is this. For now, you don't have to pay attention to in this particular clip, but this is called the skin tone line. And once our skin tones are along this line, we've got very good skin tones. And anything kind of up here, we're starting to saturate, and saturation is basically how colorful the whole thing is. The more this goes up there, the faker it's going to look for a start. And even 132 on the saturation is a bit too much, so I would bring it down to about 120. And keep in mind, you do have to add the color in to D-Log footage. Now, to be fair, the conversion LUT does a lot of that for you anyway. So we've kind of got the image in a relatively good space. So if we press the FX here, we can see what it was like before. We've got the conversion LUT on, and we've adjusted the exposure, not the exposure, exposure. So that's the first panel done here. There's other rules of thumb here on the creative. We can add a lot more in those in a while, or we can make some more adjustments. So if you want that faded film look, which is cool, but I would advise not doing it this way. We can sharpen the image if we want, and we can make the vibrance a little bit more vibrant. Now, vibrance and saturation kind of look like they do the same thing, but vibrance will only affect the reds, the greens, and the blues in the image, while saturation will kind of just do everything, except the sound effect. So the next important one here, and we're getting to the juicy stuff, is our curves. Okay, now there's two lots of curves here. There's saturation curves and there's RGB curves. You get more control, and a lot of folks will say it's best practice to use this to bring contrast into your image. For me, I just like fiddling with the original contrast on the slider and basic correction, but this can be really useful depending on what you want to do. Now again, over here, these are the dark parts of the image, these are the shadows, these are the midtones, and then up here is the highlights. Now, all of these ones here, red, green, blue, they're also curves. They also do something similar, but for example, the reds, if we pull them down, we'll add some kind of teals and blues into the shadows, which is very important. We'll get to that in a sec. And if we push it up, it'll add red, and it's a little bit counterintuitive, but until you figure it out, it's like, anyway. And so on and so forth for all of that. So for now, I am not really doing anything with this clip on the curves. And here, my friends, is the real juice. Combined with one or two of these, this is the real cinematic look. This is a little bit fiddly, heads up, but you got to practice with it. So essentially what I would suggest anybody do is take a look at the image, and if you want that orange and teal vibe, which is overdone to death these days, but it's a good way to practice and get yourself familiar with shifting around colors until you get something that looks really, really good to your eye. Look at the image that you have and then go, okay, we have blues, we have yellows, we have greens. We want to shift those colors slightly. So we want to make the blues a little bit more teal. In its very simplest form, we're going to do this here. So we hue versus saturation. Remember we said how saturation is how colorful the image is. Well, it's going to be how colorful the hue or the color is. Hue versus hue is where we can change those colors. Hue versus luma is how bright or dark that color is. And then luma versus sat, we're going to get to that because that's an important one actually. And saturation versus saturation. So I'm going to start shifting the colors around, and the quickest way to do it is use the eyedropper tool. Select a good range of the color. So let's click here, and we can see we've got a little dots here. If we take the one in the middle, and now we can pull this up or pull it down, and depending on where you pull it, you can get more or less of whatever color you want. So we can see just the tiniest nudge, we're getting things a little bit more teal. Even that icky tiny touch. And you can expand these out to make the range a little bit wider if you want. And then you can build this up as much as you want. So we can build this up really to cover all of the blues, but that looks awful. But just to give you an idea, you don't have to just take the first one in the middle. So for me, we're kind of in the teal mode here. And if we if we tick the box here, we can see it's only the subtlest change that it's made, but it makes the biggest difference. So I'm going to nudge this up once more. Tiny difference, tiny. But that's the real intricacies of color grading. Small changes can make the biggest impact. Next one up, you can either go hue versus saturation. So we can just select our eyedropper tool on the blue here, so we get a similar range. And as you can see, we're not getting all of the range, we're getting some of it. So if we go down here and we can expand this out just a little bit more, and then we can make it more colorful, or we can make it, now this is the style, right? This is where you do you. For me, I don't like things too saturated, so we can give it a little bit of pop if we want. And again, it's a good idea, turn these on and turn these off. As you can see, it's making a subtle difference to the whole thing. So that's the blue essentially done. Now I know somebody's saying it's not completely teal to my eyes. Well, let's make it more teal if you want. And then we have our hue versus luma. So again, how bright or dark this blue is. And this is where 10-bit color really kind of comes into its own here, because we can drop this down. See, if we drop this down, you can see the image is completely starting to break up now, but there is some flexibility in 10-bit color, far more than you would have in 8-bit color, because we're dealing with 1 billion colors versus 16 million colors. So similar again, we can make the blues brighter or darker. And again, this is where you start doing you. Next color up is the yellows, the oranges, those kind of colors. So I'm just going to select one of these poles here. And we can again change the color, so we can see it's not changing everything, but it's changing some things. So let's push our yellows to orange a little bit. We can make our saturation, how colorful it is. We can push this up so you can see things are having an impact. We've started off, this is where we're at, and it's very much a case of back and forward. One thing as well is the colors here. You know, the white parts, white should be white, so we can have no color in those. Doesn't make very much of a difference. You can squint and you might see it. And then for the other colors here, greens tend to be in an orange and teal scenario, not necessarily greens. So we have a couple of options here. Our hue versus hue, we can expand this out and we can build this up so we can see the colors are starting to shift there. You can see them subtly move around. And again, if you need some more control, click in that part and we can see we're kind of going into the browns and that just a little bit more. Some folks may just completely desaturate the greens. So we can bring all of this down and you can see subtly. Again, this is where the style comes in, and this is where it's so important to start fiddling about inside here. Now, speaking of fiddling about, you can also drive things a little bit more by going down to our color wheels and match. So shadows, again, the dark parts, the midtones, and then the highlights are the bright parts. So we can click on this little X here and we can bring a little bit more color into our shadows if we want. Again, it's quite subtle if we want to bring that teal vibe. Our midtones generally should be a little bit orange. Ultimately, it's push and pull. So if the shadows are going this way, then the midtones need to be going the opposite way. And the highlights, again, we can bring those up if we want. And then we can see right across the image here, it looks pretty good. And if we look here, we can see, okay, it's pretty well exposed. Borderline on some of the colors in the yellows and reds there, maybe a little bit too much saturation, but it's okay to my eye. And if we go back here again, I want to bring the shadows up because I want to bring a bit more detail to this. Now, what about stylizing this a little bit more? So go back to our RGB curves, and I always will kind of fiddle with these towards the end of what I'm doing. So let's bring in a little bit of green and blue to the reds. And then if we want to bring a faded look, this gives you complete control of how much fade you want to put in as opposed to just pushing a slider. We can add a little bit more contrast. We can pop up and then we're good to go. So that's where we started. So you can see I'm refining, and that's where it does take the time, but like we're only a couple of minutes into this video and it hasn't taken that long to get here. And this is where LUTs again fall down, because you can't just stick the one LUT onto everything. So let's paste in our effects. It's like, it just doesn't really work, this Lumetri effect from this one to this one, totally different day. So you can start resetting everything and going again, or you can start modifying. But remember what I said about the skin tones in this line being really important? Well, these look a little bit red to me, and human eyes really know if skin tones are off. So what we can do here is something that's going to take a sec, but it's really easy to do. First off, I'm going to zoom in to 200%. If we press the H, we can scroll around in Premiere Pro. And then if we go to the opacity here and select the free draw Bezier or the pen tool, we can just draw a rough square or whatever shape you want. And I'm just going to bring down the feather to 0. And if we go to Lumetri scopes, once it updates, it's going to show us whether this skin tone is on the line or not. Sometimes it takes a while for it to refresh. If you go from one window to the next, it may update it. So if we look here, and let's turn off the other one so we can just see our vector scope completely, we can see it's not necessarily on the line. Now there's a couple of ways of doing this. We can expand this a little bit more to give us a little bit more scope, just to make sure we're not after getting unlucky in one spot, and it's most definitely going towards the reds. So I was right. Too much red. A couple of ways that we can do this. Probably the easiest way really is you can work off those particular colors. So we go to hue versus hue, and we can make these a little bit more, not green, but if we move them slightly, you can see the line here is changing ever so slightly. So that color is there now. That's one way of doing it. And if we turn off our mask, we can see that that skin tone looks a bit better. For me, it's definitely lacking a little bit of saturation. So I'm going to select here, I'm going to select his leg, and then I'm going to push up the saturation just a little bit more. So now we can get a better idea. Yup, this looks a lot better. Might be a little bit too much, so let's bring down the saturation. And if we go back to our scopes here, we can see that it's right on the line, and we've got really good looking skin tone. So keep that in mind. But most important thing, if you take anything away from this video, you cannot just take one Lumetri effect or one LUT and just dump it on to all of your footage. To recap here really quickly, there's a couple of things that you have to do. First off is you have to start with the correction, which will be the white balance and the exposure and all of that. And then the other side of it is the grade, which is the shifting of colors and moving them around to whatever color it needs to be. And it doesn't need to be anything. It needs to be what you wanted. But these tools here are the way to do it, ultimately. And some folks will never talk about this because it's like an inside secret. I don't care. This is how you do it. Now, all of this might seem a lot of work each single time that you do it. I have left a link in the description for some LUTs that I've built out for the Pocket Tree that might just help you, or might not, but check them out. And if you check them out, you're supporting the channel and supporting me. Speaking of the Osmo Pocket Tree, it's shaping up to be one of my favorite cameras of the year, and I've made a whole bunch of mistakes with it. So if you want to avoid those, check this video out right here.